The day the envelope arrived, the sky wept. Rain fell slow and stubborn, turning the red earth into thick, bleeding clay. It dripped from the thatched roofs of the village huts and collected in shallow puddles that mirrored the swollen clouds above. At the edge of the village, just beyond the dusty main path, stood the old post office, a square cement block painted in fading white and blue, its front porch shaded by a sheet of corrugated iron that clanged like metal teeth in the wind. Ndèye stood under that porch, barefoot, a pale gray shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her feet were covered in a thin layer of red mud, but she didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the envelope in the postmaster's hand. It was simple, plain, brown, a bit soft from moisture, sealed neatly. Across the front, in black ink, the writing was unmistakable. Neat, familiar, unmistakably his. Pour ma femme. For my wife. The words hit her like a whisper from the grave. She didn't reach for it at first. Her arms stayed folded beneath the shawl, stiff as stone. Behind the desk, old Bira, the postmaster, looked at her with a silence that carried the weight of years. He knew her husband. Everyone did. Mamadou had been a beloved teacher, a man of quiet wisdom and long walks. He had died barely 4 weeks earlier, suddenly, in his sleep, no warning, no goodbye. Yet here was his handwriting, his final message, arriving not by miracle but by postal delay. It had been sent from a small city 5 hours east, 2 days before his death. No one had known. Not even her. Ndèye took the envelope slowly, her fingers brushing its damp surface like she feared. It would vanish. She did not speak. Bira offered no words, only a slow nod, then returned to his chair. The rain continued to fall, soft and constant, as if the world itself had decided to mourn with her. She walked home the long way, through the field behind the school, past the mango trees that still bore the carvings of young lovers' initials. Her shawl soaked through, clinging to her shoulders like the grief she carried. The envelope remained in her hand the entire walk. She never tucked it into her bag, never hid it, but she also never opened it. When she entered her compound, a quiet cluster of rooms surrounding a small courtyard, she went straight to the corner of her bedroom. She opened the bottom drawer of her wooden dresser, lifted a small calabash filled with dried hibiscus petals, and laid the envelope beneath it. She did not cry. She did not speak of it. Even when her daughter, Aminata, asked who the letter was, she only said, "It's nothing important." And Aminata, only 12 then, didn't push. She had seen enough grief to learn when not to ask questions. But Ndèye thought of the letter often. It haunted her like a song she could not remember the words to. In the morning, when she tied her wrapper and stepped outside to sweep the sand from her doorstep, she would glance toward the drawer. At night, when the winds howled across the dry plains and the spirits seemed to whisper through the cracks in the walls, she would reach out, touch the dresser's wooden edge, and feel the weight of the words she had not yet read. She imagined its contents again and again. Was it a confession, a secret? Had he loved someone else? Was there something he had done? Something he had never told her? Or was it something gentler? A poem, perhaps. He used to write them when they first married. Or a prayer, a final blessing. Or maybe he had written nothing important at all. Just, "Take care of Aminata. Be strong." Something like that. But she could not bring herself to find out. Because if it was love, she already felt it in the way he used to look at her across the firelight when no one was watching. If it was guilt, she had already forgiven the unspoken things. And if it was something that could shatter what little remained of her peace, she would rather not know. So the envelope stayed sealed. Years passed. The rainy season gave way to dry harmattan winds that carried dust into every crack of every wall. Aminata grew tall and beautiful, her father's eyes glowing behind her, mother's silence, The village changed. New solar lights were installed. Children now had books. Even the post office got a new coat of paint. But the envelope remained, still sleeping in the dark of the drawer, untouched. People moved on, but Ndèye never remarried. Whenever the chief gently suggested that it was time she think about companionship again. After all, a young widow should not be alone forever. She would smile and say, "My heart is already full." They assumed she was being poetic, but the truth was simpler. Her heart had paused with Mamadou's last breath, and she was not looking to start it again. In the stillness of early mornings, just before the call to prayer echoed across the village, she would sometimes dream of her husband. In those dreams, he was always walking ahead of her on the dirt path toward the baobab tree, the hem of his bubu brushing the ground, his hand swinging slightly, always just out of reach. He never turned around, never said a word, but he walked like a man with peace in his heart. And so, Ndèye chose peace too. In silence, in waiting, in never opening the envelope. Until one night, many years later, her breathing became shallow, and the night air felt heavier than before. Aminata, now a grown woman, sat beside her bed, wiping her mother's forehead with a cloth soaked in cold water. The stars outside blinked softly through the open window. A final storm rolled gently in the distance. Ndèye's lips moved slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. But that moment, that sentence, would not come until the final chapter. It was the sound of goats bleating and metal spoons clinking against enamel bowls that pulled Ndèye back into the village. He hadn't planned to return. Not after Mamadou's funeral. Not after watching Ndèye crumble silently behind the curtain of her veil, standing alone at the edge of the grave while the village men filled it with sand. Ndèye had stood in the back, just beyond the acacia trees, sweating under his white caftan and clutching the small leather pouch that held the truth of everything. But he had said nothing. Now, 7 years later, he was back, older, heavier, and with hair that had surrendered to gray. His shoes kicked up familiar red dust as he walked toward the post office, his eyes scanning the village like someone watching an old film reel, one frame at a time. Children played beneath the neem trees. Women laughed as they pounded millet, and there it was, the same low concrete building with blue paint peeling like old secrets. Ndèye was not just Mamadou's friend. He had been his brother in spirit, in life, and once, long ago, in betrayal. Inside the post office, Bira still sat behind the same desk, though now his hands trembled as he reached for a pen. He looked up, squinted, and grunted with surprise. "Ndèye Diop? You're still alive?" "Just enough to finish some things," Ndèye replied, managing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Bira chuckled, coughed, and poured him a cup of baobab juice. They spoke of small things, the rising cost of diesel, the new health post, how the rains hadn't come on time. But neither mentioned Mamadou or Ndèye. The ghosts were patient, watching from the walls. That afternoon, Ndèye walked the narrow path to Ndèye's compound. It hadn't changed much, the fence still made from woven reeds, the mango tree still leaning slightly to the left, as if whispering to the house. He paused at the gate, took a breath, then entered. He found her in the back courtyard, seated on a low stool, shelling ground nuts into a wide calabash bowl. Her movements were slower now, her back slightly bent, but her presence still quiet and firm, like someone who had stopped needing to prove anything. At first, she didn't look up. "You came," she said calmly, as though she'd been expecting him for years. "I was passing through," he lied. "Of course," she replied, and cracked another shell. He sat beside her in silence, reached into the bowl and began helping. For a long time they said nothing. Only the sound of shells snapping and wind brushing through the papaya leaves filled the space between them. Finally, he said, You never opened it." Her fingers froze, and for a moment, he thought she might stand and leave. But she only looked at him, truly looked at him, and said, "You knew?" Ndèye nodded slowly. "He asked me to deliver it, that day. But I was too late." The air grew still. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. He swallowed hard. "Because I was afraid that what was written inside might destroy the version of him you kept." Ndèye smiled then, a tired, knowing smile. "You men think you protect us by hiding pain, but we carry it anyway, in silence, in our bones." Ndèye looked down. He couldn't meet her eyes. "There are things I should have told you," he said. Things I should have told him. Her voice was quiet. "Then tell me now." And so he did. He told her about the trip Mamadou had taken to Dakar 2 months before he died. How he'd been sick, but hid it. How he'd gone to see a doctor, not for treatment, but for final answers. How he'd written the letter that night, in the dim light of a small hostel room, sealing it with hands already shaking from fever. "He cried," Ndèye whispered. "That night, he cried and said he was sorry. Not because he was dying, but because he had spent years being afraid to tell you things you already knew." Ndèye was quiet, her hands still resting on the ground nuts. "What things?" she asked. Ndèye took a long breath. "That he regretted not giving you more. That he sometimes doubted himself as a father. That he feared dying without having told you how much he loved you. Every day. Even when he didn't say it." A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. Instead, she looked at the sky, where a gray cloud passed, slowly across the sun, casting a soft shadow over the courtyard. "I knew all of that," she said finally, "even without the letter." Ndèye watched her, his heart tightening. "So why not open it?" Ndèye stood slowly, her joints cracking. Softly, she walked to the doorway of her room and gestured for him to follow. Inside, the dresser stood just as he remembered. She knelt, opened the bottom drawer, lifted the calabash, and revealed the envelope. It was yellowed now, the edges curled, but still sealed. She held it in her hands, staring at it. Then she said, "Because love isn't in ink. It's in what stays after the silence." She placed the letter back, closed the drawer, and turned to him. "You came for closure. I already have mine." Outside, the wind picked up again. Children laughed somewhere down the road. A rooster crowed even though the sun was high. Ndèye left with nothing in his hands, but something had shifted in his chest, and back in the drawer, the letter waited still, a sealed truth, resting quietly in the shadow of a woman who had already read its meaning through the way he once held her hand in the dark. The night Ndèye fell ill, the village grew strangely quiet. No drums, no laughter from the youth under the neem tree. Even the goats kept to themselves. The air felt heavy, not just with heat, but with a kind of waiting. In the far sky, thunder growled like a beast slowly waking. Inside her room, a kerosene lamp flickered on the floor. Shadows danced along the mud walls. Aminata knelt beside the bed, pressing a cloth to her mother's forehead, her other hand holding tightly to the edge of the mattress. "Mama," she whispered, "can you hear me?" Ndèye's eyelids fluttered. Her breath came slow and shallow. Her skin was pale under the soft light, her lips dry and cracked. She hadn't eaten for 2 days. The healer had come and gone, leaving behind bitter roots and quiet prayers. But, deep down, Aminata knew. This was not a sickness of the body. It was a calling. The end was near. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Ndèye stepped in, his long tunic soaked with rain. He had been sitting under the baobab tree for hours, watching the clouds gather, waiting for a sign. He removed his sandals, stepped in quietly, and sat across from Aminata. She nodded at him but didn't speak. Then, a whisper, so soft, it could have been the wind. Ma Phil, my daughter, Aminata leaned in. Yes, Mama, I'm here. Ndèye's eyes opened slowly, their usual fire now a fading coal. There is something, she said, her voice dry and slow. In the bottom drawer? Aminata blinked. The letter? Ndèye nodded. Ndèye held his breath. You knew? Aminata asked. I saw it once. I thought maybe it was from Papa. But you always told me not to touch. Ndèye smiled weakly. You obeyed, like your father. There was a silence. And then, with the final strength her body could summon, she said the words that would forever etch themselves into her daughter's heart. If it is love, I already felt it. If it is regret, I've already forgiven. Aminata's lips trembled. Mama! Ndèye reached out, her fingers brushing her daughter's wrist like a falling feather. Some truths don't need words to be known. Those were her last words. She exhaled one final time, softly, like the sound of cloth being folded. And then she was gone. No cry came from Aminata. Not yet. Instead, she leaned down, placed her forehead on her mother's shoulder, and stayed there in silence as the thunder cracked open the sky. The funeral came 2 days later. The whole village gathered, just as they had for Mamadou. Women in indigo wrappers wept openly. Old men sat on prayer mats, murmuring verses from the Quran. The chief stood beneath the same baobab tree and spoke of dignity, of strength, of a woman who carried her grief without ever making it someone else's burden. Ndèye stayed until the last clump of earth had been packed into place. Then he went, back to her room. He asked no one. He entered silently, as he had once before. The room smelled of dried incense and old hibiscus petals. The kerosene lamp was gone now, replaced by a shaft of daylight from the window. And there, in the corner, the same dresser. Ndèye dropped to his knees. He opened the bottom drawer. The envelope was still there, yellowed, patient, sealed. But there was something else beneath it now. Something he hadn't seen before. A small notebook, leather-bound, no title. He picked it up with shaking hands and opened it. Inside, page after page in Ndèye's careful handwriting. Not prayers, not grief. Letters to Mamadou, each one dated on the anniversary of his death. 1 every year, 7 in total. He flipped to the first. It has been 1 year. I still wear your shawl when it gets cold. Aminata laughs just like you. She talks too much, like me. You would love her even more now. The second. I dreamed of you last night. You asked me to forgive you for not saying more. But your silence was a language too. I heard it all. The third. Ndèye came by today. He still carries guilt in his eyes. He shouldn't. He was only the messenger. And so it went. 7 years of letters, written but never sent, folded quietly into a book that lived beneath the sealed envelope. Ndèye's hands trembled as he held them. His heart broke and mended at the same time. She had never needed to open Mamadou's letter because she had already answered it, again and again, with her own. He placed the notebook back into the drawer, picked up the envelope, turned it over in his hands. Should he open it now? Should he finally reveal what Mamadou had written? The secret, the confession, the apology. He hesitated. Then slowly, he placed it back, still sealed, still whole. He whispered, to the quiet room. She was right, and then he closed the drawer. It was the season of dust when Aminata finally left the village. The Harmattan winds swept across the dry fields, coating everything in a pale film of sand, rooftops, bicycle handles, prayer mats. The air smelled of ash and sun-warmed soil. Ndèye had been buried for 3 months, long enough for the hibiscus plants in her courtyard to bloom again. Long enough for silence to settle not just in the house, but in the heart. Aminata stood in front of her mother's room for the last time, holding a small bag in one hand, and in the other, the envelope. She had found it in the drawer, exactly where her mother said it would be. It hadn't moved. Not even an inch. Still sealed. Still carrying the weight of all the years it had been ignored. She had sat with it every night since the funeral. Some nights, she wanted to tear it open, to demand from it the truth her parents never spoke aloud. Other nights, she held it close and felt her mother's voice surround her like wind through the grass. Some truths don't need words to be known. And in time, she began to understand. Her mother had not left her without answers, only without ink. She had left her with presence, with patience, with a silence so full, it echoed louder than any confession ever could. Now, as the taxi driver honked from the road, Aminata took one last look at the compound. She walked to the baobab tree behind the house, the one that shaded her father's grave and now her mother's. She knelt, swept a palm across the red dust, and placed the envelope between the roots. No tombstone. No final reading, just this. A gift returned to the earth unopened. She stood and whispered, "If it was love, I already saw it. If it was regret, I already forgave." Then she walked away, leaving the envelope behind. Not as something forgotten, but as something understood. 6 months later, in Dakar, Aminata stood in the center of a university lecture hall, her voice calm, her words deliberate. She was reading from a page in her notebook. Not her mother's, not her father's, but her own. "My parents taught me that silence is not always emptiness," she said. "Sometimes it is love's most faithful form. My mother never opened my father's last letter, and I never will, but I live it, every day." The audience, students, professors, strangers, listened in complete stillness. Some wiped away tears. Others simply closed their eyes. She closed the notebook, bowed her head, and walked off stage. In the village, the envelope remains. Some say the roots of the baobab have wrapped around it now, that nature has claimed it the way it claims everything, slowly, lovingly. Others say the envelope is still there, dry and whole, untouched by time, because some things are too sacred for even the earth to swallow. But the truth? The truth is this. No one ever read what was inside, because they didn't need to. And maybe that was the point all along. Fade out.